All right, well, thank you all and welcome once again. I'm Phil Gould, teaching the English department at Brown University, and I'm presiding over this session. Momentarily, I'm going to introduce our three speakers. I've cleared it with them, and I think I'm going to adjust protocols slightly, and after their presentations, see if we can't then turn to the audience as a way of facilitating discussion. And panelists can, of course, respond to one another as they wish. A few preliminary thoughts that I've had anticipating the conference. Also, after attending the morning sessions, I think that the theoretical and historical and political issues surrounding the subjects of history and memory, terms that seem so commensurate and aligned with one another and yet have complicated relations, should be further pursued in this session. One issue that comes to mind is the relation between individual and collective forms of memory, historical memory, that was addressed in an earlier session, particularly whether the individual and collective forms of identification are so neatly aligned as we would like. A second issue that's related to that involves that between the categories of memory and trauma. Trauma seems to be an inevitable component, political, intellectual, public, and that models of trauma that focus on individuals' psychology and recovery have been useful to literary and cultural critics as well as historians. And a second question that, to my mind, that an earlier session raised that's germane to this one is whether those individual models of trauma and recuperation, how they might apply to collective forms of memory and history and ultimately of justice. And then finally, and this goes really to the title of the session today, and that is, what does it mean to be between history and memory? I've thought a lot about that, and I have no sufficient answer, except that it seems that these two terms are, in today's sessions, raising questions that go to the heart of the conference and of the occasion and the formation of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and that is, what is the relationship between the academic enterprise of history and historiography and public forms of memory and historical memory that we as academics are engaged in and thinking more seriously about. The very fact that memory may change the category of history seems to pose challenges to traditional assumptions about our own professional and academic expertise and methods. So our speakers in order of how they're listed on the program today, Paul Gardulo has worked towards building the collections and exhibits for the Smithsonian Museum of 19th Century History and its newest museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He works in many fields, including African American history and culture, slavery and cultural memory, public history, and the African diaspora. Since 2006, he joined Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Our second speaker is Keila Grinberg, who is professor of history at the Universidad Federal do Estado de Rio de Janeiro, and she's the author of many, numerous books written and or edited. Her 2002 book, which is being translated into English, is entitled A Guarantor for All Brazilians, Citizenship, Slavery, and Civil Law in the Time of Antonio Pereira Rebouças, which looks at how slavery and racial thought shaped law and liberalism in the decades following Brazilian independence in 1822. Her her publications are too numerous to list. Our third speaker is Wayne Modest, who's head of the curatorial department at the Tropen Museum, and he was previously the keeper of anthropology at the Horniman Museums and Gardens in London, and also previously director of the Museums of History and Ethnography in Kingston, Jamaica. His interests are diverse and broad in museology, material culture, museum anthropology, the histories of ethnographic collecting, and the practices of exhibitions. After 4 o'clock, I don't know, some sort of free pass. Again, he's published on the public humanities and museum collections extensively. For example, the essay, "We've Always Been Modern: Museums, Collections, and Modernity," which appeared in Museum Anthropology in 2012. He's currently working on numerous editorial book collections in these fields. So we'll hear from our 3 panelists and then turn things over to you, the audience. Just to remember, there's a brief break and a final component to today's programming that starts around 6:15. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the post 4 o'clock panel. I'm standing, but I don't have a PowerPoint. So my comments today come from personal experience, and so it'll be a little bit of a personal narrative. But I think that I hope that you find that it touches on and resonates with many of the themes that were raised throughout today, and particularly may touch closely on some of the questions of the prior to lunch panel, and the question Wayne had raised about how does this become global, and what are the challenges, not just of a comparative globality, but collaborative one. And also the final question from this morning's panel, which spoke to the complexities of balancing public with private or local memories. So today, I'm a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I'm also the lead representative on that project from the museum in the Slave Wrecks Project, which is an international collaborative initiative now hosted by the NMAHC that uses maritime archaeology as a lens and slave ships as a point of entree into better understanding the history and enduring legacies of the global slave trade in a way that builds important bridges based on this shared history across race, culture, and nationality, between researchers and communities in multiple nations, between ancestors and descendants, and the past and the present. And so, as such, I'm not sure that I necessarily qualify as a conventional historian, but I will take up the task of trying to make a simple intervention to provoke thought on some of the ways in which historians can play a role in the practice of public history and on the subject of slavery. It is important to situate myself in this discourse and practice, not just as a public historian and curator, but as a white male American public historian and curator working for a national museum in the early 21st century that is dedicated to sharing with the global public a narrative suppressed, forgotten, and denied about the centrality of not just slavery, but of African American history and culture to our nation and to the modern world. And so I want to take you into a position I was put in this context a little more than 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, in Maputo, Mozambique. In the spring of that year, in our spring of 2014, my work in connection with the museum and the Slave Wrecks Project brought me and my colleague, Steve Lubkeman, who is here today, to Maputo to more fully engage with the Slave Wrecks Project especially in relation to a signature feature of it, its central mission of capacity building, which in its most simple form, or rudimentary form, makes sure that the project is conducting professional training and helping people in the places where the project works. South Africa, Mozambique, St. Croix, etc. Build skills in underwater archaeology to build and diversify the still quite colonialist field of maritime archaeology, and to foster a collaborative sense of stewardship about the history and heritage of the global slave trade that connects land sites to marine sites to communities and community institutions. As part of our visit, we were asked by the United States Embassy to provide a public talk, along with a screening of the then recently released 12 Years a Slave. And so we were in Maputo in a dilapidated Art Deco theater with several hundred people, and thank goodness our comments came before and not after that visceral, searing film. But I experienced something unusual that night in watching the film amidst hundreds of people practicing my Portuguese translation across as I struggled with jet lag and without air conditioning. And what I noticed throughout the film was a disjuncture for me as a viewer, that at moments of extreme violence in the film, there was quite a bit of disruptive commentary and even laughter in the audience, and I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't quite understand how to place my viewing of the film in concordance with the audience. And I wondered, is this a cultural reaction to violence? Is this a problem with the translation or a mistranslation of some of the things? I don't think I necessarily still quite understand the answers to that question. However, the next day, when we were at Eduardo Mondlane University and speaking with some of our partners, I had a conversation with a now friend, Decio, who's an archaeologist, and he was telling me his family history and the history of his wife, who's a historian. And she's studying her family history. And particularly her family's travel through the trauma of the War of Independence, where her father, who was a physician, was disappeared from his family for a period of 7 or more years. And suddenly for me, the potential meaning of this film to that audience in Maputo had taken on a new shape. What was purportedly a film about Civil War era United States may have been read by those members of the community as something very similar to something they and their families might have experienced in living memory in a post-colonial landscape. And so I think that for me is a first encounter with the complex ways in which narratives of slavery necessarily have multiple meanings across nations, cultures, and publics. And we should take very good care, because of that fact, to not make assumptions, and we should make careful care to pay attention to our preconceived notions of what slavery may mean, and to the crucial balance and conversation between local, national, and international narratives and meanings of memory. And so I just want to take that moment and fast forward to a little more than a year later, when the Slave Wrecks Project work brought us back to Mozambique, and this time to Mozambique Island, further north, a World Heritage Site that has for over a millennium been a center of trade on the East African coast to both the Indian and Atlantic Ocean. Our collaborative research conducted with Ezekiel Museums in South Africa on the wreck of a ship, the São José, off the coast of Cape Town, had led us back here to Mozambique, this time with Steve and with my museum director, Lonnie Bunch. Now, the São José had sailed from Mozambique Island in December of 1794 with 512 captive Mozambicans aboard, en route to Maranhão in Brazil. It got caught in storms and swells around the Cape of Good Hope and wrecked close to shore, where 200 of those 512 chained below decks perished in the waves, and the remainder, rescued, were transported to the slave lodge, which we heard about earlier today, in Cape Town, where they were sold into slavery in the Western Cape. Research by an international team of partners had uncovered documentation on the ship and its owners in multiple archives, from the Netherlands to Cape Town to Lisbon and Maputo. Careful documentation and retrieval of some of the remnants of this wreck and their conservation had begun, and we were preparing to make a large public announcement in coordination with Ezekiel Museums and George Washington University, our most central projects in the effort in Cape Town. And this announcement would have been and was an attempt to place, we had mentioned big data earlier in the last presentation, to place the massive scope of the global slave trade across centuries on a human scale through the lens of this one ship and its story that we were attempting to bring back into memory. And we were consciously doing so. And so as part of that public moment, it became important for us to bring my director to, in his position as director of a new national museum, to Mozambique Island to retrace the voyage. Here he would retrieve soil from the village of Moçario, which was on the land side of Mozambique Island across the bay. This was one of the most likely sites of departure for those enslaved from the Mozambican mainland before being boarded onto ships that docked at the island, at the Ilha, to load their holds with human cargo. Lonnie was entrusted with a basket of soil from Ivano Nogash, a traditional leader and elder from the community who instructed him to, quote, bring the soil to the wreck site and to spill it as close as possible to bring those who were lost back to their homeland, that they were now found and remembered. But it was also crucial to Senor Nogash that a message be brought as well, that those ancestors needed to know that they had descendants, right? That their communities still existed. Gathering all of the local leaders from the surrounding villages around us, he pointed them out to us face by face. Surely among the fallen, he said, were those who were guardians of these same communities. Tell our ancestors that their people are still being cared for, that they still have leaders. Right? A powerful moment, to be sure. Pointing to each, he continued, though, in a different vein to engage us all, that now that we had made this connection and brought this story back into memory, he entreated us now that we needed to also pay attention to the conditions and needs of these communities, their health, their welfare, and their futures. He made the palpable link to that past in a way that I would argue was very much in accordance with Ruth Simmons' claim last night, that the way we make the past meaningful is what we do now in the present. So, and I'm wrapping it up now. So what have these experiences taught me? And what might we pay attention to? For us, what began as a search for a single ship has created an arc across multiple geographies and across time. And that comes with certain responsibilities. Work on this single trajectory, along with others now engaged on the Slave Wrecks project, presents us with challenges and opportunities as individual researchers, and with our institutions, be they universities, museums, historic sites, or on other demands, on historic sites. These challenges demand that we do the following, I would argue, when confronting this global past. That in uncovering the past of slavery and the slave trade, one that has been submerged, forgotten, or suppressed, our attempts to make it usable, meaningful, and public must be done in collaboration with publics and communities in their complexities, from the local to the global. That this engaged critical approach is one that is, and that it is public, is one that assumes that a rigorous research agenda is one that is shaped by and speaks to and with this wide variety of publics in shared authority, and builds that capacity among all, not just a capacity for technical or professional skills, but that too. But what I'm talking about is, as Nancy said earlier, a capacity for imagination, a capacity for knowledge and learning, for understanding, and ultimately for action in addressing the enduring legacies of that past to promote understanding, healing, and justice in the present and future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizers, especially Professor Roquinaldo Ferreira here at Brown, for inviting me. It's a true honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. My presentation will follow the one made by Professor Abby Matos this morning, as we are partners in the same project on the memory of slavery in Brazil, entitled Passados Presentes, Past Presents. But I will address on some of the specific topics that has some of them been raised before, but especially trying to answer some of the questions raised in the session. But as she did too, I will start with a little teaser that describes our project.
Passados Presentes é um projeto de turismo de memória inédito no país. 4 roteiros, a partir de um aplicativo para celular, conduzem os visitantes a locais emblemáticos para o tráfico negreiro e a história da escravidão no Brasil, em trajetos pelo Quilombo do Bracuí, Quilombo de São José, Cidade de Pinheiral e pelo centro do Rio de Janeiro. Cada um dos circuitos contará também com uma exposição permanente sobre a história e cultura locais.
Oi, gente, nasci na Angola, Angola que me criou. Eu sou neto de Moçambique, meu Deus do céu, eu sou negro, sim, senhor.
Nos quilombos e na cidade de Pinheiral, os pontos de memória foram identificados pelos moradores, descendentes diretos da última geração de africanos, em parceria com as historiadoras que coordenam o projeto. São eles que contam a história local a partir do que ouviram de seus pais e avós.
Então aqui começa a trilha. Quando o pessoal vem, eles adoram passar aqui, né? Aí eu vou falando das árvores, dos palmitos,
E aqui foi uma fazenda que eles receberam príncipes aqui. O rio Paraíba era navegável, se trabalhava-se o rio Paraíba. Era uma casa, um casarão, assim, muito bonito.
Olha que paredão aqui, ó, feito pelos escravos. Então, aqui é onde saía a água para mover o moinho, tá? Aqui era um moinho velho. Olha, aqui dá para acessar a internet, tá? Pode comunicar, mandar fotografia.
Todos os pontos de interesse histórico estão demarcados com a logomarca Passados Presentes e um código QR. O visitante abre o aplicativo, aproxima o celular do código e tem acesso às principais informações sobre o local.
Aqui está o zongueiro velho, nos tempos atuais, fazendo uma ginástica. Para ficar sarado.
É isso aí que o Gonzaguinha gosta.
So, this project developed in this website that most of you have seen already this morning. I won't stop here. I just want to invite you to browse it at some point, and also to download our app, which is available in English right here. Download the app or the folder. This is, unfortunately, is just for Google users, not because of any preference, but because Apple has been taking forever to approve this. As you were all able to see in the video, our project relies as much in the memories of the traditional communities as in the historical knowledge brought by us, professional historians. Memories of traditional communities in Brazil, first created by former slaves and its descendants along the 19th century, are a very important remnant of the Brazilian slave past. Different than here in the US, African slave trade was open until the 1850s. Only in the 19th century, 2.5 million Africans were brought to the country, most of them to the coffee plantation area, the Paraíba Valley, located between the states of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. They were brought to a country where 1/3 of the population was enslaved, but also another third of the population was descendants of slaves and either free or freed. By the time slavery was abolished in 1888, many former slaves remained close to the area where they used to live, creating the so-called Quilombo communities that exist until today, some of them pretty isolated from the urban areas until recently, without access to electricity, public education, or transportation. Nowadays, their culture and memories of the slave past became important political tools for them to be formally recognized as a Quilombo community that include collective property rights to the lands where they have been living over 100 years. So for them, or for some of them, to receive visitors is a way to make sense of the existence of their own communities by being able to tell their stories to children, to students, and to the tourists that go there. But it's also a way to make a living out of their culture and memories. And here's where our project fits in, putting together their knowledge, our historical knowledge, technology, and design. We want to contribute to publish their knowledge, showing to people that a central component of Brazilian history is being kept by those groups. The memory of a genocide, the memory of the African slave trade to Brazil. An important piece of our project is that even though it's based on an app, we really want people to go there. So the app is actually not about, and the website, you're not going to find all the content there, and you're not going to find all the content in the app if you don't go to the place. So there is a trick, which is only if you go and scan the QR code, and I won't tell you what's there because I really want you to go there too, you can have access to everything. So it's really about technology making possible people to meet real people. It's about the real world, if we can say that. But I don't want just to advertise our project, but also share with you some of the questions and challenges we have as former conventional historians. And I would just raise 3 of them. The first one, which is not so new, but still somehow controversial among traditional historians, is to recognize the role of memory in building historical knowledge, and the fact that historians do not have more knowledge about that subject than the members of the communities we're working with. In fact, it's quite the contrary. Their memories have been crucial to the new history of the illegal slave trade that it's been now written in Brazil. But also, the way in which those communities remember and narrate their past is also being shaped by the fact that they have been working for the past 20 years, when Abby started doing this, with historians. So both discourses are being changing because they relate to each other and how we deal with that. The second challenge is about the historical narrative we are writing. Working in this collaborative project means that every single word is in science or website or app is being written by at least 3 historians. Imagine that. But more important than that is the fact that not only members of the communities are equally authors of that historical narrative as we are, but also the designer, the tech guys, as we are not writing a book or an article, we are writing an app. So working collaboratively as historians, writing in non-traditional ways, and sharing the authorship are big, but also wonderful challenges. We believe we are growing as historians and also writers by working that way. And to conclude, the third and probably bigger challenge is that this is a political project, and we must openly recognize this. We are historians doing political work. We side with the quilombolas. We defend reparation rights. We use the historical knowledge to help them fighting for their rights. Of course, no one here believes that there is such a thing as objective truth or objective knowledge. We know that all knowledge is political, but to say that out loud poses important questions to professional historians. How valid is our work? How reliable? Is there a line between the professional history and the political work? Given the centrality of the public discussion over the slave past in Brazil, this is not a small issue. Some colleagues believe that the quality of the history we are doing is undermined by the fact that we are acting too much as activists. To them, and maybe to think out loud about some of the questions that we have been talking about, I think that working as public historians, writing science and apps, brought an importance to that historical narrative that we can only hope our scholarly books once achieve. There is a common sense, I believe, here in the US, but also there in Brazil, that the past is irrelevant to the present. We public historians are helping to bring the past to the center of the contemporary public debate. I think this is not a small thing, And I also think this is our main responsibility as historians. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to the organizers, to Tony, to all of his team for inviting me to speak. I start out by locating myself. I locate myself in now living and thinking about these things in Europe, in the Netherlands, and I think that that is important in that being located, because I think I'm invested in the comparative understandings of these things, primarily because I want to understand how do we live as humans differently within the different political projects in which we are conscripted. I start out by the challenge that, by quoting an article that I really like by Ross Poole, where he says, "I will argue that the role of memory is not simply to provide us with the cognitive access to the past. It is also to provide a route by which responsibility for past events is transmitted to the present, and thus to identify a locus of present responsibility for these events." If there is anything that the museum is, or if the museum is in between history and memory, then for me, the museum is a space where one needs to practice a particular kind of responsibility for how we share that past in the present. And so I see the museum work that I do anyway as an attempt at an ethical work in the present to try and structure how we understand how we can live together. Now, I should also say that one of the things I find interesting with this conversation as it has been going on is the double relationship between history and memory, how we think of history and the word truth claims have come up as opposed to memory in a more fluid way, where I've come to myself not trust history. History is not something that one grows up in from the perspective of my own colonized background to trust so easily. So one has to think about how we use that word truth claims and truth when we talk history as opposed to memory, which we think of in different ways. I start out with that quotation by Baldwin. And I'm interested in it because the urgency of my presentation today is that statement, "I am here, we are here." And one of the things that I think that my museum, the museum I work in anyway, and you see them there, I'm at the Research Center for Material Culture, and those three museums are a part of it, is that we're located in a moment where the new challenges that you've identified in this conference is not just challenges of how to write history, how to think memory, which one works differently or better, but rather that there's a contestation in the Europe that I live in right now to say that I am here and I have the right to be here. And many people, the questioning of citizenship and who is the citizen and who can be the citizen after the colonial project in Europe today is the urgency of the new challenges that I would like to locate this in. Because one cannot, I think, at this point, think about a conference like this, to think the slavery past, to think the colonial in the post-colonial moment, without thinking of the connections between your own recent elections, in connection with Brexit, in connection with what is happening in France today, in connection with what is happening in Germany, all of that we've come to think about what I've come to call an anxious politics. That we live in an anxious moment now, and that anxiety about being here, about who has the right to be here, is fashioned around a certain racialized body that we think has come to take away what is ours. So if it is that museums occupy that space between history and memory, how might we fashion histories, memories, that acknowledges the fact that the space in which we've come to live today is a space that was configured by the colonial project. And that colonial project means that many people who are struggling have the right to be there, and not that there are some accident, that an accidental happening in Europe. So, thank you. So I've been working with a colleague of mine to try and map out how do we describe the Europe of now? How do we describe the urban landscapes in Europe today, where these these anxieties about security, unemployment, all of that is mapped onto some people who we claim shouldn't be there. They should go back home, as they say. So what I'd like to do is to go through a series of projects that we've been doing, just to show you one example, that colonialism there's a lot of work on it in Europe today. This is an exhibition that is at the Deutsche Historische Museum in Berlin, which is on German colonialism, a very interesting exhibition. One of the things that a very extensive exhibition with a massive amount of objects in them. One of the things that I found interesting about this exhibition was not necessarily only the exhibition, but was the visitor book. Two comments were very, very important for me. One person said, and Bambi, I see you're in the audience, one person said, this was a really good exhibition. I hope Tervuren will address their history in a way that they've done it here, so boldly. The other person said, I hope Australia does that as well, address the colonial past and deal with it. But that was because I couldn't read German. So when I was celebrating all of this positive valorization for the exhibition, somebody said to me, no, if you were to leaf through the book and read the German, what you see is a lot of criticism. What about, why didn't you show the good sides of the colonialism too? This exhibition is too left-leaning. What about what we did for them? So it was interesting to see how therefore is this museum participating in trying to understand the afterlives of the colonial in Germany today, but also what does it mean for those people who are struggling to belong in Germany. How museums remember what museums remember. I will run through 4 exhibitions that were done in 2013 to mark the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the Dutch realm. And this exhibition, 4 exhibitions in Amsterdam. Interestingly, this was at the special collections of the Amsterdam University, which took an interesting, very, very deep historical trajectory, but had to start out by showing us that slavery happened everywhere, and that the transatlantic slavery was one in many. An extremely wonderful archive was worked with a Surinamese collector who lives in Belgium, an amazing collection looking at the Suriname colonialism in the Caribbean. Then there was the Black Pages, which exhibitions. An exhibition which was at the Maritime Museum, which I found quite interesting. They started out with the kind of CSI. So you had the CSI numbers. And one of the things when I say, how do we remember? One of the things that struck me in this exhibition was that there was a number game going on. And it said France had transported this millions, and England that millions, and we only did this amount. Then there was this exhibition which I found interesting in a certain boldness in some of the things that they did. But one of the things that interests me, and to be honest with you, the Amsterdam Museum has been one of the museums that is located in the city center that has been trying to grapple with what does it mean to be a city after the colonial moment, that we are a changed city, and how do we incorporate the narratives of the people who've come here, both through the colonial project as well as through labor migration. And what struck me interestingly about this exhibition is that it says here, the golden age, and then in that yellow thing that goes on, it says, now with the Black Pages. So there's a Golden Age exhibition that doesn't have the colonial past in it, and then they put the colonial past in it, and then after the celebration, they take it out. So it inaugurates this continued idea that there are two different kinds of histories. And then the last exhibition that I wanted to show you, which is, and all the three before, and to be honest with you, I hate critiquing colleagues, because I'll tell you that doing any exhibition, as I said, on the colonial project is not easy. So we can all say how it should be done better, but it is not an easy project. Oh, the exhibition at the Tropo Museum started from a different perspective. It didn't start from the history, but it started from what was happening in the present and how do people live together in the present as they try to structure a life after the colonial past. Now, what I'd like to, and this is what I wanted to go back to, that if there is a new challenge and if there is a question, why now? For us in the Netherlands anyway, for me and the work that I do, why now an engagement with the colonial project, with slavery and its representation, is exactly the kinds of activisms that are emerging from young people who are saying that they demand another kind of history to be written. And how do we as institutions collaborate with, work with those activisms that are trying to fashion new forms of history writing without conscripting them into a kind of governmentalized happy narrative? How do we allow them to speak and speak critically without making it so that we whitewash, water down the kind of activisms that they're involved in? So I start from the extreme left. I need to wrap up. Extreme left here, where this was, and many of you might know of the controversy, the ongoing controversy around Black Pete, the blackface figure in the Netherlands. And this was a recent demonstration in Rotterdam where the police showed its stripes again in saying that, in being quite violent against the demonstrators against Black Pete, who are trying to say Black Pete is racist. And that incident happened probably 2.5, 3 weeks ago. You can actually see it online and see there are many people who place it on Facebook. But also recently at the University of Amsterdam, where the students basically shut down the university for a little while, the Senate House for a little while, to say that we demand a new kind of university. And in that shutting down, which was around the, and probably a Dutch-speaking person could tell me what rendement is, a kind of profit politics of the university, seeing students as profit margin. The students started that, but ended up with a conversation about what would it mean to have a different kind of curriculum. How do we structure a university of color where we have Black professors as well? And what does that mean as part of the struggles today? I'm interested to show you this because if I were to ask why think slavery in the present, then I think that these are the kinds of urgent politics that is happening that ties Black Lives Matter to Rhodes Must Fall, to University of Color, to whatever else is as they're trying to close down Cambridge University in the present, to say that if we don't look at those histories as well, then nothing will change. And I always try to end with this, because to be honest with you, seeing all of this, working in the space that I worked after Brexit, after recent elections, I've been thinking, is there hope? And can we fashion hope in this present? And I have not come out with an answer yet. But what I suggest, I keep repeating a statement by Terry Angleton where he suggests that optimism is a fallacy. Hope is something that we can work on. So in that regard, I'm interested in the possibilities of hope that some people are practicing. And 2 examples that I'll give you that I think are very hopeful is when Teresa Balka, Hodan Barzami, and Simona Seyfark, and I wanted to call their names out here because it is their project, came to do a project at my museum called Decolonize the Museum, where what they did was they participated in a real trenchant critique of the institutional practices, how we write histories. And if you see on the left, right there, there's that yellow sign. One of the project was to post those yellow signs throughout the entire museum. So saying basically, this is how the museum write history. This is how history can be written from a different perspectives. And I think that those kind of projects are projects that we need to invest in without, and my last thing, on December 11, I have the second edition of what I call Hip Hop Museum. And Hip Hop Museum is a way of inviting, is recognizing the contested histories that we have as museums like mine and the objects that we have in them, and inviting people to come and write their own narratives with the objects themselves. So I invited popular hip-hoppers to come and write inspired by the collection, to write new stories about what the colonial past could look like differently. And that's a way to articulate with a younger public that is more interested in this than they are sometimes interested in the long texts that we write. So I will go back to Baldwin by saying, if we cannot contend as museums with the fact that we live in the afterlife of that colonial, and that we are here, as Stuart Hall, it was Tony who says, because you were there, then we are not doing enough work as institutions in that public sphere. Thank you.
All right, so there are lots of questions and issues that have been raised. These presentations probably connect through, myriad ways, but certainly the topics of translation and mistranslation, the ethics of public history, its relationship to the traditional academic discipline of history, the issue of collaboration, expertise, the issues of space, thinking of the global through both physical, actual spaces as well as virtual ones, like an app, and probably many more. So thank you all individually. I guess, do we have microphones in the aisles? We can open things up. With the lights, it's a little bit difficult to see everyone. So scream and shout if you have to. If there aren't immediate questions from the audience, feel free among our panel to respond or to pursue one another's work as well.
That's good.
We're faced with the waning hours of the day.
And would you just mind, we're a relatively intimate group here. Who are you? And
Oh, hi. I'm Caitlin Hopkins. I teach history and literature at Harvard.
great.
And I'm wondering about this question about the sort of the colonial history of the museum, and especially as that relates to the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, working within sort of the Smithsonian as an institution that has this long colonial history. And I was just wondering if you could speak to some of the politics of how it is to imagine a new museum sort of with it under the umbrella of the Smithsonian institution, and how that's working out. Yeah.
I think that's a great question, and I think that those are some issues that were really raised this morning in some key ways, and I love that we got that really nice brief history. I think one key thing to remember through that question is my museums, the National Museum of African Americans History, relationship to the Smithsonian writ large, of which it is one of 19, right? But it's distinct, in my mind, division from, because of its lack of a foundational collection. That our museum was chartered with the explicit mission of building a foundational collection. And in fact, the apocryphal story, and I don't know how apocryphal it really is, was one of the reasons that it was held back congressionally after years of being put forth by Congressman John Lewis, was that there were those who were in the congressional body who was saying, well, there's no history there. Besides music, besides sports, what is the history that you can collect, and could it fill a museum? And so thus the charge of this museum became to found a collection. And I think that for me is the most powerful story of our museum, is this work that we've done reaching out to collect and curate the beginnings of a national collection and what that means. And I think I'll leave it at that, and I think we can pick up that question. I don't know if that directly answers your question. I don't know if it hedges it for me, but I think that is a profoundly important story of our museum's birth and its relationship not just to the Smithsonian, but the way it relates to a variety of other African American museums, right? That exist across the landscape of the United States.
Can I jump in on that as well? Because I think that is, I'd actually think it differently in a way, similarly to building a collection, but from another perspective. Because one of the questions that happened within the framework of the Decolonized Museum Project was, one person asked me, why do you need to decolonize it? Why not just close it down? Is it possible for this institution to be able to do that kind of work? And that troubled me. It troubled me because it was a good question. But I'd like to think about it differently by suggesting that if it is so that these museums have been implicated in the particular past, that particular colonial past, that particular kind of colonial project, through collections, through the representational practices that they've been a part of, then one could also suggest that there is an ethical burden for them to participate in the undoing of some of that, and that there might be the possibility of utilizing those tools, those collections, as part of the work of doing that. Now, one has to think about how we fashion other futures for these institutions, but I would suggest that it is a part of its current responsibility to be a space of redress. And perhaps acknowledging that colonial past, and we can't escape it because we are in a building that was called the Colonial Museum, built for that. Acknowledging that past and dealing with that is a part of its ethical project in the present. Yeah. So I would suggest that if one were to think that there is a connection between that past and the present, these institutions are there to be able to do that work. And that's how I would formulate it.
Yes. Do you want to respond or follow up, or others, Tony?
Oh.
Please. We've got prosthesis coming.
I think that's a very interesting and perceptive question about how the relationship of the museum as part of the Smithsonian will play out over time. And I guess my comment is I don't think we know that yet. As a member of the Council of the Museum, I can detect already that there are going to be issues that arise because of pressure from Congress and other government officials, not to mention the public beyond that group, that try to control what is exhibited in the museum or not exhibited in the museum. And the question of how that will be handled is very much a question because of the way that the Smithsonian institutions are funded. So my point is that the support that this museum currently enjoys from the African American community, certainly, in this country, and I suspect from many people around the country, will be its insulation from the kind of malevolent behavior that can surface against the museum. And I must say that before we opened, I always thought that given its location and given the content of the museum, that it was very likely to be the target of people who wanted to dismantle it, or certainly to call into question its legitimacy. So we have to be prepared for that to occur, although it is protected in a sense by the Smithsonian Board and so on. But there are powerful interests in Washington and elsewhere that will in fact want to have a say-so in what happens with this museum. And I think the more people who go to the museum, the more insulated the museum will be from that kind of interference. But that interference has started already.
And thank you. And I mean, I think, yeah, we do live in a destabilized situation, and even a national institution. And so that, I heartily concur, and I would only say to think back to Elon's earlier question about smaller institutions, and what does that mean for smaller institutions who don't have that insulation, and the need for us to extend our position to them as well. And so that's all. Yes?
Just a quick question. Are you assessing curatorial objects in the museum? Is that a part of your mandate?
I'm sorry, what?
Just wait 1 second. It's a little bit cumbersome, but probably helps the audience as a whole. Thank you.
I just have a quick question. Are you assessing curatorial objects as part of your mandate, for the museum?
So you mean?
Are you building a collection? Are you creating a collection? Do you have the funding for a collection?
Yes.
Okay.
So yes, the museum has a collecting mission. The museum has a collecting budget, has a collecting committee. And that budget comes both, that is federally mandated, part of our annual budget, and is also raised through private funds. Now, and it's important that that collecting mission continue now that we're open. History does not stop. And so, I don't know if that answers your whole question, but there are others in the room who can speak to that issue as well.
Can I ask my question?
Yes.
It's a simple, can everyone hear me? It's a simple question for Wayne. I love the idea of younger generations rewriting some of the history, and I wondered if you could give us a couple of examples of objects and how they rewrote the text and what your sort of reactions were, if you were surprised, if you expected what they said, and so forth.
It's gone.
It's gone.
Yeah. We have a project now which where we ask the question, how do these primarily 19th century collections function in the present, and what do they do? And one of the things that happened when we started the project, people said, how do you prevent bad histories from being written, or colonialist thinking people from coming in and writing old-fashioned things? That hasn't necessarily been the experience. One of the persons who came in was a hip-hopper who came in to question how we displayed and wrote about the past of the Dutch Caribbean, and he was concerned that it was there was a kind of absence in the writing and how that was written in the narrative of the museum. So that leads us to the question of of what are we going to do next around that, and how we can rewrite that history. But the entire Decolonize the Museum project was in many ways, one person asked, for example, one person asked whether or not we could, our representation of Africa and how that is represented, and why do we exclude certain narratives and include other narratives. One of the really, really contested part of the conversation was just the words that we use and whether or not we aren't reinforcing stereotypes through words associated with specific object labels. So the writing that the young people have been doing are very varied. It's extremely, extremely different in different contexts. In fact, one person even asked us, which we didn't expect, that kind of hit us from the side, because we thought, okay, we're addressing the colonial past, and it was colonial history that we're talking about. One person made an amazing connection, which was important for us, between gender, sexuality, and accessibility, and asked the question of, what do we mean by access in this institution, and whether or not it isn't an institution of limited to the full-bodied, able white person who wants to come in rather than thinking access. So it comes from very, very different perspectives. Some of it is easier to deal with, others not so.
Yes, down here.
Can I just ask, Wayne, in relation to those movements you've mentioned, the Decolonize a Museum, we've had, with the Rhodes Must Fall, as well as the Fees Must Fall, situations at times where it's actually polarized the very people involved in the protest across, the racial divide. Mm-hmm. And you've had the Rhodes Must Fall movement has been used in some cases to make attacks, for example, on statues of Gandhi. And there's been an accusation that Gandhi was a racist, and therefore there's no place to commemorate him in South Africa, which then becomes something of an attack on people of Indian descent. So has there been something similar? Have people been able to see an integrated history? Or is the world heading in this way where we've got the conservatism on one side that seems to be growing all over the world, and we've also then got racial divisions that are happening on, various sides?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. To imagine that there is some kind of overarching or there aren't differences in the different projects that are happening would be a fallacy. I think that every activism in some way or another is very located to a specific cause. In a way, within a lot of one of the interesting things with the young people who we've been working with anyway, but also that you see that now in what is happening in the Netherlands, which I find quite positive, is that questions of race, gender, and sexuality are thought of together in certain instances, which can be very, very productive. And so that happens as well, but it does not necessarily mean that the competing activisms do not hit against each other. Yes, that happens and I can tell you that the news media, they love that. They love to actually put people against others and say, see, you say this, but the other person say, yes, that happens as well. I would be interested to think, however, that there has been, and I think that's one of the reasons why I was asking about social media, there has been an amazing difference in the kinds of solidarity practices in recent years that I've seen anyway. And people, sometimes I'm afraid of it, and I'm going to say this right now, and forgive me, sometimes I'm afraid that the particular kinds of there are dominant tropes in the activisms as well. And so what I see in the Netherlands, sometimes I find it very much tied much more to the Black American context than to the Dutch context. And sometimes you see that as competing, that you wonder, how do we practice these solidarities where it is still also located? And so you see that happening as well, that there's a kind of dominant narrative of what blackness might mean that sometimes is drawn so much from what the flood of things that come through the new media from the US. that doesn't necessarily always account. But I think that some of the things, the overarching practices, I'm much more hopeful in the context in the Netherlands. I know that it can be divisive, and it is divisive. If you see what is happening, especially against especially women, black activists in the Netherlands, it is frightening. And that's why I wanted to start out with the statement, we are here, because a lot of those young people are not so young, they're my age, and I'm not young, are fighting to say, we are here. And that, I think, is positive in some ways.
Paul, Wayne, I wonder when that comment,
Which
we
one?
are here.
Right, okay.
Yeah? How much weight do you put on the locality of that statement, the here versus it being existential?
You mean the human as opposed to the...
Yeah,
the
I mean,
citizen?
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that statement means to you in this context.
Well, I mean, if you are talking about the question of how I see it, anyway, Baldwin phrasing it is not one or the other.
Uh-huh.
It is the idea that I exist, but Baldwin, in my view anyway, has always participated in thinking about what this country means and how this country does a certain violence to him as an American. And within the Dutch context, I think, or within many parts of Europe, and one of the things that I really want to say here is that it is not, these anxiety politics is not in the Netherlands alone. It is France, it is Belgium, it is wherever. I think that it is located in a citizenship claim. It is a claim to wanting to be a part of a history, being located there, being written into that history, being written into the museum that writes that history in ways that doesn't marginalize people's practices of being. So it is a claim to that locality as well, to say,
so here is both time and place then. It's both temporal.
Yeah.
And is here, in citizenship, does that always break down along national lines? Or, I mean, because a lot of what this project globally is up against, as recent events show, is the kind of downside of nationalist sentiment.
No, but I don't know if it is it only national. One could say one of the nice things about thinking comparatively as well is that it is urban. We claim this city as our own, and we are not necessarily so much of the nation. So the city is ours, and that's one part of the structure. We are here as black people who have a right to be here. And existence and want to move out of this marginality, so not necessarily along the national lines, and which is why those global solidarity projects are interesting, to think that it is not just national, it is also across borders that people claim a space. So going back to your question about an existential claim rather than a national claim.
Just making sure we're not losing anyone in the, yes, back there.
So this is a question for Wayne. Sorry.
Again?
So you spoke about the ways in which museum as a colonial space, the importance of sort of reappropriating that history. How would you apply that to American universities that are facing similar issues with Princeton, Woodrow Wilson School, or Yale, Calhoun College, and the importance of whether it's stripping those names or what would you say is the proper logic for sort of confronting that?
No, I must admit I wouldn't want to speak for the context of the US because I know so little about that. But one of the things that I find always fascinating, I work in what is called ethnographic and anthropological museum. And one of the interesting things as museums, they've gone through a long history of critique because of the link with the colonial project, but because of anthropology as a discipline and how people think that implicating is. And I've always found it funny that people do not critique history museums in the same way. or critique art museums in the same way, as if those disciplinary frameworks have not been also implicated in forms of exclusion and violence. So in that regard, just tying back to what you're saying, I think that's why I think that the challenge of saying new challenges in this program actually links up the struggles in the museum with exactly what is happening in Princeton now, with exactly what is happening in Brown, or all of these kinds of institutions that are struggling to ask the question, how do you connect with a changing polity, with a changing way of thinking history, with a changing narrative about who belongs and who doesn't belong. So I see that as rather a globally interconnected and sharing struggles around what does it mean to be an institution with baggage in the colonial past in the present. So I see them as not separate histories, but overlapping and connected histories.
I wonder if we could extend your question to Professor Grinberg. Is this an issue in Brazil as well? I mean, are there parallel controversies in institutions of higher learning and their attachments, their legacies to slaveries, the names that they bear, the funding, their histories?
Certainly, our institutions are much newer, younger, and our universities don't have even 200 years. But we do have, I think that there are two ways in which you can relate to that discussion. One is the fact that Brazilian universities have been pretty much, even though they are public, the best ones, they have been pretty much in the first 100 or 150 years of existence just for the Brazilian white elite. And very few members of, the main part of Brazilian society have been part of the Brazilian universities. And we have been dealing with this through a lot of public discourse, political actions, affirmative actions to try to understand what does it mean to democratize the Brazilian universities. And that means dealing with the issue of what is, who are our students, what's the composition of, and what we should do to deal with the slave past, not in the same way as we think, but in different ways. Also, the fact that, I mean, thinking about the museums, the fact that we have been colonized by the Portuguese doesn't mean that we don't have our only colonial museums, and we do have them. So the whole issue and the discussion about citizenship and how visible people, Brazilians are, have been in the heart of the discussion of some of the Brazilian national museums, how the collections are built, how we also have our own colonial collections that came from Africa, and how the whole issue about reparation is being taught. So I really actually love the idea of decolonizing the museum without, I was going to ask you, without deleting the past, because you cannot shut down the museum in some ways. Just because it's a colonial museum means shutting down the past. So how we deal with the past that is uncomfortable without just deleting it? Because if we delete, we are also sort of trying to forget something that existed. So a colonial museum is also a place of memory of the colonial past. So it's much better to deal with the tension than to try to pretend it didn't exist.
The concept of decolonize, though, was, and somebody else raised this, which I found interesting. One other person said, tying to that the museum should exactly be colonial because it reminds us. But I think that the people who work, the young activists who've worked with the term decolonize the museum, is not suggesting at all that one needs to unremember the colonial past, but exactly to remember.
No, I agree that. It is just that when you ask your question, it's someone saying, well, why do you just then close it down? And I like, it will be the easy the easy answer for that.
Another question over here?
Yes, hello. My name is Marcela Echeverri, and I teach Latin American history at Yale. I just wanted to call attention to a very interesting parallel precisely about what you're discussing right now in terms of post-coloniality from the perspective of, let's say, Spanish America, to complement what we've heard about Brazil, and thinking about the intricate relationship between nation and difference in Latin American context. For example, since the beginning, the independence wars almost, the leaders for independence were actually reflecting about their relationship with the native people of these regions of Latin America. And in some ways, one might say that they co-opted that Americanness or nativeness for their projects of independence and anti-colonialism, right? Obviously, from the 19th century, when this happened until today, these national projects have transformed, and these questions about, very similar to what we're discussing today in relation to slavery, but in relation to indigenous peoples. So yes, definitely difference, multiculturalism have been reflected also in questions of identity. So I wanted to ask Wayne, how you envision this European, recreated nation, so to speak, right, into incorporating these differences, right? Because, my intuition is that there could be no nation that would engage these problems that you're posing in terms of memory. This aim for citizenship is also an aim for an imagined community. And it seems like there's a lot of conflict going on, and I'm not sure that, I want to know if your project is to actually be either included in the nation as a citizen, or simply to, should I say, destroy the nation or undo the nation or reinvent the nation. I just, I would like to hear you talk about this.
I sit as a person working in a museum in an academic context, so forgive me if anything I say is a little less than academic. But I would suggest, first of all, I'm not really hopeful that all of the theorization of moving beyond the nation state is going to happen anytime soon. We propose it and all of these theories talk about it, and it's nice to talk about, but the nation state and regionalism and all of those isms are being more and more being entrenched, even as we try to imagine their disappearance. So if that is the case, what my project, or it is not even a project, what my imaginations are, rather, is to ask the question, at what moment do we understand the French citizen or Frenchness to not look only white? That is my question. At what moment does that person who walked through the immigration going into France not get stopped because they look different? Difference is a part of the constitution of how we understand ourselves. I love the idea of, thinking alterity, thinking all of those things. It's going to be a part of the nation. But one has to understand that the current conception of the European doesn't look like me. And so we need to move to a moment when that is possible, when it is possible that that person might look like me. And now, if you are suggesting that difference is, if one of the projects that I'm interested in right now is to think what we call the multicultural with what I call the multi-historical. That one is that several places that we call a multicultural polity is actually constituted out of people with not just cultural difference, but different historical trajectories that lead to a particular moment. Because if we don't reimagine that, then what we do is to continue to say that after 6.5 generations of being in a place, I'm still foreign. In addition to that, and I think it is, and I don't like quoting, but Gilroy has a nice statement that I'm always conscripted into migrancy, no matter what. And if one doesn't reimagine a polity where I can be a part of, after 16 generations, then I think we're going to constantly being in this differentiated citizen marked by racialized bodies.
Can I just reply a couple of things? One of them is that
I like this. This is
okay.
That's what we want. Yeah.
It's good that you're here.
But it's very curious that you stress difference in what you just said, because you talked about different histories. I'm sorry, I don't know if that was the exact wording. Why not common histories? I mean, the history of colonialism really is a shared history. So, I see an interesting tension, and I'll just say another thing.
Beautiful.
Well, precisely about colonialism, that, and I want to be hopeful and all of that, but you have to also be careful that there can be some co-optation in that process of reinserting the colonial narrative precisely from that point of view, which is, yes, you are also French. What could be on the other side of talking like this? It's, you are also, I don't know, I'm going too far. You are also ours, maybe? Like the boundaries are expanded conveniently to include others. I mean, that's what I think there are interesting tensions in the projects going both ways.
No, I agree that there are going to be that. One of the things that, and I like your point about different histories. I see it a little bit differently because I think it is a common history, but we enter into it and are interpolated differently by it. So we share that common history, but it's still one that is constituted through a different movement into those histories, and one has to account for that. I don't think that's why I don't use the word. There is a Dutch. That's why I don't like the word shared, because we've been using this term within very many policy documents called shared histories, and that shared histories always seem very apolitical. We share the history,
But shared always is kind of implicitly built into in the we are here. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think this exchange is very productive. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. Mm-hmm. But she's, if I hear you correctly, sort of putting pressure on that, that adage, that goal, position. Not that it invalidates it, but I mean, to go back to your earlier anecdote about the airport and who looks European and who can claim a place. I think there's maybe some other people want to, or do we have other unrelated, questions that take us in a different direction, which is fine.
Can I follow up on this a little bit? I want to enlist the panel as a kind of consultant group, post facto. We were involved about 7 or 8 years ago in developing the interpretive program for the President's House project in Philadelphia. And I think Jim Campbell this morning mentioned that before that project got underway, already the quarters for the 9 enslaved people that George Washington had in Philadelphia had been destroyed in the Liberty Bell project. And the idea now came up after a lot of to and froing with the community that the Park Service would now allow for an interpretive installation that would describe the executive, that would in a sense build a kind of ghost structure of the executive mansion that George Washington and Martha Washington and 9 enslaved people, and Washington had to rotate those 9 people every 6 months so that they wouldn't achieve emancipation under Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law. We attempted to synthesize an understanding of that house so that it would be one history, so that rather than think about the executive mansion in terms of what the Washington administration, presidential administration was doing in terms of Neutrality Act and Hamilton and Jefferson and who met in this particular building, we wanted to emphasize the fact that the building was a conflation, was a kind of convergence of 2 very different cultures, and that the nation itself, like the household, was a mixture. So that the ironies of the house were that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was debated in the House while two of the 9 people actually escaped. So there were all of these wonderful connections. And we would do this largely through a kind of interpretation of the House as a kind of mixture of these different cultures. And then there would be videos that would be presented that would dramatize the circumstances of conversations between the enslaved people and the Washingtons and so on. What happened is that it was very difficult for us to get agreement on a kind of synthesized, unified, single history for the House. And instead, a kind of awkward compromise emerged in which a very conventional narrative of political history dominated the kind of framework and an exclusively African American interpretation.
Wow.
We'll get back to you later on that. Don't go away.
My question is, how come you ended up with the structure that you ended
Convergent.
up? Why did the dominant structure of the House provide the? Why was the political narrative given to the? In your rendition right now, I haven't been there, Richard. Given the dominant narrative, and why was the African American narrative the performed narrative?
I mean, there again has to do with the local politics, but with the professional politics within the community itself. And we couldn't find an argument that would allow each of those groups to hit permeation of their domain by the other. They basically have a trade-off. I guess so we wind up with multiple languages in interpretation. There's no way of synthesizing this in a fresh way. We want to create a really fresh way of looking at the early republic as itself a heterogeneous place, as a place which had a complicated mixture of white and black.
So what you're
but one driven by huge contradictions of power.
I'd like to.
Hold on. We've got a couple colleagues that have been waiting patiently. So this is quite productive, and I'm sure we'll spill out and continue on over the next time. But you've been waiting patiently, and then in the middle here as well. Please.
I think the moment for my question kind of already passed. I'm going to take it back to the previous conversation. Your question about shared history and why you're focusing on difference. And I wanted to know if that's maybe sort of the operative distinction between history and memory. Is that sort of useful in a rhetoric sense to make that claim about the difference between history and memory?
To be honest with you, I can't answer. I can't answer that
Can I jump on that?
Yeah.
I just also going back to this idea of national or just one narrative and conflicting narratives. I think that one of the things that we need to address is that either history and memory are full of tensions, and we need to have in our discourse, even if it's one discourse, or if we are trying to put together many voices, that all this is built under lots of tensions. So it's a shared history. Of course, it's a common history, thinking about common events that we shared in different places, but they are full of tension. If you try to, and I was thinking about my own presentation that I didn't have time to talk about all the tensions between like us historians and the groups that hold the memory, when they were saying like, we refuse to put this picture on. We don't like that picture. It reveals a part of our past that we don't agree with. And then we had to redo the whole thing because they refused to show one picture that we thought was relevant one. So I think that in all these issues of between the difference of history and memory and the writing of even if we need to write just one narrative, it's just that incorporates the idea that there is no history, or even there is no memory without the idea of conflict and tension. We have to deal with that. And this is an issue of the present too. It's the issue of bringing visibility to groups that are claiming and recognizing that our ideas of citizenship have to be much more complex than before, and also to recognize that some groups do not want, as I'm thinking about an earlier question, do not want to share their memories, or do not want to have that visibility, or do not want to share some of the citizenship rights that they are entitled to. And that's part of the deal too.
I just wanted to go back for a minute, but not very far. So the George Washington issue, I kind of lump in a very quick catchphrase: institutional racism. And I think it accounts for a lot of memory and history in this country. And the issue of not looking like a European, or in the United States what an American is, I think is a reflection, and I would say an indictment on the educational system, starting from the very, very beginning. And when you have young children exposed to one scenario or one group of images that say this is what an American looks like, or this is what, then you are fostering and you're almost brainwashing, inculcating into these young people a vision of what someone is supposed to look like. So it's incumbent upon me, and collegially, people in the field of education across the globe, to break down those misconceptions in very, very purposeful and deliberate ways. It's one way that I see hope in the situation.
Yeah, maybe we could, before we,
Yes.
Is there someone over here in the back?
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to come back to what Wayne said, and I really appreciate the distinction you made between multi-culturalism and historical. In 2006, a journalist in a very important French newspaper could write, the difference between the United States and France is that the United States has known slavery. And nobody answered that. I mean, he, as a Frenchman, as a white Frenchman, could not even remember that France had invented the black code. The reason why is because it was not on the same, exactly on the same land, I mean, geography. Slavery was mainly happening in the Caribbean island, or in Louisiana, when part of America was French. I mean, universal. So it was in the Caribbean area, and in France, they had ideas, they had all this intellectual construction about who the others were, who we were. But they did not integrate that we were, they were, and we were living the same history at the same time. And in France, multiculturalism doesn't exist. It's just unhearable for a French government, because since the revolution was supposed to make everybody French, equal, liberté, égalité, fraternité. That was the revolution philosophy. And it still is, except that it's not true. It's an idea. So, liberté, égalité, fraternité, so you will be like us, French, white French. And this is why multiculturalism is not hearable and understandable for French politics and all what we hear. And what we will hear probably for the next month before and after the presidential election will also turn around this. And the idea, and I will certainly use it, is talk about a multi-history. We have different point of view of the same history. And decolonizing museum for us, for instance, in the Memorial Act, is to tell the story from another point of view, not just one voice, not just one sound. And this is what it's about, in my opinion, and one of our challenges. And some people told us about the Memorial Act, well, you know, it's a little bit, why is it not more, you know, more rude and more, and so, yeah. And I finally answered, you know, we all can have our exoticism. And for us, it is very exotic to see that. It is something different for us. We could have this wood, a museum in wood, etc. I know exactly what you could, what you mean, but it is not what we want. We want something that make people make an effort to think about what can be in. And it's not because it's European, it's because this difference make people move from their use and what they used to see, what they used to be compared with. All of the museums in Guadeloupe are in ancient colonial houses. So this is also decolonizing museums. The architecture, what is inside, the way you tell the stories, the way, what you show inside. It's a complete work to do, and it's not, well, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Do you want to respond, or I don't know if we have other questions that are pending. I'm trying to.
It's Wendy.
Well, I think people have their hands up, so let's
we probably
let
have
people
time for
continue.
another one before we
Yes.
break.
People are
Okay, sorry.
Thank
with
you.
the lights. Go ahead, sorry.
I wanted to return to Paul's experience of laughter in the showing of 12 Years a Slave in Mozambique. Because it intrigues me, and as I'm sure it disconcerted him at the time. I mean, Hannah Arendt wrote about the problem of representations of violence years ago in the context of the Eichmann trial. We put conventions around violence all of the time, and I suspect one of the reasons why you encountered that experience in Mozambique was because the genre of the film of 12 Years a Slave stepped outside of the conventionalization of violence prevalent in Mozambique, and therefore people were disconcerted, and when we're disconcerted, we laugh. Not because it's funny, but because we're disconcerting. So the problem of the representation of violence is a difficult one. So my question is, how do you, in the context of the Smithsonian Museum, keep the extremity of violence that constitutes slavery alive and avoid its normalization within the experience of the museum? How do you work to keep violence alive in the context of your work of representation?
That's a great question. I think there are a number of ways, and I didn't mean to, try to reduce that one experience. It was in terms of watching that film. I think you're absolutely right. Now, in the museum, one way that I've worked to explore histories of violence, and specifically has been in collecting, and I think it's talking about processes of collecting in communities as well as exhibiting. So one story that I spent a great deal of time on over the past half dozen years is collecting in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to tell a story of the pogrom, you might call it, in 1921. when a white riot, when the entire black section of Tulsa, North Tulsa, known as Greenwood, was completely devastated, burned to the ground, thousands of structures, untold lives, and with the absolution or permission of the authorities, the white authorities, there. The Red Cross was not allowed in for days. And so the question became, right, how, not just how do we tell a story of this violence, but how do we begin to collect around this kind of devastation and destruction? And I think that and how do you do it in a city that has submerged this history and been riven by been riven by questions of race and racism. And I think it's a long process that in our context involved forging partnerships with families in North Tulsa, and also trying to help better connect them with traditional white institutions at times, over time, and it's still an ongoing process. And so what this means is, and luckily we have a partner, the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation there, that actually helps to exist as an intent as an intermediary. The collecting itself was a process of trust building for us to gain the trust of families who would allow materials to come to the museum. Materials from a theater, the Dreamland Theater, that had been burned to the ground. That not only spoke to the destruction, but the uneasy rebuilding of the town of Greenwood by its community members. To the letters and telegrams between a mother and son that still spoke directly, we talked about trauma, to the clear trauma she was still experiencing 10 years after, even after having rebuilt her business and home. So you find, so what I found was very small materials, 5 pennies that were collected by a young boy named George Monroe, whose home was burned down, who hid under his bed while white mobs came through and looted prior to the burning. And he found the pennies on the streets after and kept them for his life. And when the Reparations Committee, and Jim Campbell knows this story, we were talking about it, I don't know if he's still here. When the Reparations Commission was engaged in the late 20th century, after much political fighting, Mr. Monroe began to give those pennies away to people who were helping to spread the story. And those pennies were in turn donated to the museum. And so I think this is a long way around to sort of saying, to explaining the need to recognize the value of things, of collecting ordinary objects that are damaged, that are in other contexts seemingly meaningless, but in the context of the incidents in which they occurred and the histories that people carried with them over time, much like the tin that carried Mr. Trammell's Freedom Papers. These things take on new meanings, and we need to exhibit them intact with those meanings and in combination with the voices of those people who carried those meanings and survived that destruction.
So I'm sorry, but I believe in order to set up for the next session that we're going to have to end it there. I'd like to thank you all, first of all. Thank Tony again for organizing the conference, and particularly thank our panelists for their presentations. It's very productive. Thank you.